The struggle over expanding and contracting the suffrage, of letting more or less people in, and the political consequences of either of those things could not be clearer than it is to us today.
Welcome to this conversation on the history and legacy of the women's suffrage movement, which resulted in the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which was finally ratified by the last required state, Tennessee, 100 years ago, precisely yesterday. We're going to be talking about this movement, which is really one of the paradigmatic social protest movements in US history today, a struggle that developed over 3 generations that was forever entwined in both inspiring and troubling ways with the Black freedom movements. And that finally resulted 100 years ago in the largest extension of voting rights in American history. It's also a struggle, I think, that is newly resonant today as voting rights again take center stage as the presidential election approaches. It's newly resonant because protest movements are again gaining a great deal of attention, most notably the Black Lives Matter movement, and because a new wave of feminism is taking shape in the Me Too era as well. Our lead guest today is acclaimed UCLA historian Ellen Carol Dubois, and she is the author of numerous books, and as well as the just published Suffrage, Women's Long Battle for the Vote, which I have right here, and I read and I much enjoyed. Later in the conversation, we'll kind of turn toward the present and also toward issues in Hawaii, and we're going to be joined by 4 other guests. The Superintendent of the Hawaii State Department of Education, Christina Kishimoto, Khara Jabola-Carolus, the Executive Director of the Hawaii State Commission on the Status of Women, Sandy Ma, the Executive Director of Common Cause Hawaii, and Punihei Lipe, Director of UH Manoa's Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Center. My name is Robert Perkinson. I'm a historian at UH and the coordinator of the Better Tomorrow series. And Ellen, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. That was a wonderful introduction.
I should note that we have about 500 people, I think, signed up and who are joining us on Zoom. And then there's a lot of others who are also joining on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. So we have a big audience. They will sometimes be sending in questions. We've also gathered questions that many of them submitted before. But I think a good place to start is that, you know, just to remind folks why the suffrage movement really still matters today, even though it reached its apex 100 years ago.
Well, you know, this question used to stymie me a bit, but it doesn't anymore. And that's because the struggle over expanding and contracting the suffrage, of letting more or less people in, and the political consequences of either of those things could not be clearer than it is to us today. We can see that, I'm going to get a little political here, conservative forces like to keep the number of enfranchised people down and keep that limited to the people that they know how they vote. And they don't like to expand the franchise to larger and larger numbers of people who cannot be controlled. One of the reasons that the suffrage movement took so very long is that no party ever thought that it was sure it could, no party expected that it could get the benefits of enfranchising women. Women were too diverse, too various, too numerous, and so enfranchising women would never would come to the benefit of one party or the other. Unlike, for instance, the enfranchisement of Black men in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, which the Republican Party was willing to do because it could count on their votes. To repeat, I really feel like in some ways the question about why is the right to vote important is answered for us today in the incredible struggles to repress and to increase the electorate.
Yeah, and I think all of the central issues surrounding suffrage are so newly resonant you know, the efforts to kind of use the vote to try to create a vision for a different society, the decisions about who has the right to vote, the entwinement with the Black freedom movement, and you know, and just the incredible victory of a social movement generally. I would, at least August notwithstanding, and all of the attention that's been happening right now, it seems to me as a historian that the suffrage movement generally does not receive as much attention in the curriculum or in history textbooks or on the History Channel as,
It does not.
say, the civil rights movement does. And I'm, you know, wondering why you think that is.
That's a really interesting question. I have trouble answering it. I think in general, and this may get me in a little bit of trouble, the stereotypes and the sexism is of a different quality than racism. It's a sort of it's not as manifest. It's sort of buried in our gender identities, which are really crucial to who we are. And the notion that somehow women are not important voters, that the enfranchisement of women was relatively insignificant, that women are not powerful political forces. That's changed a little in the last 4 and even more 2 years. But it's been the case for a long time that women's political presence has not been considered powerful or significant. It's part of sexism that women are seen to be not powerful and not political people.
Yeah, I think that is probably right. Another reason may be that, you know, as new generations of progressive historians came to the fore, there was a reassessment of so many suffrage leaders and the racist turn that the movement took from time to time. And I thought it might be worth kind of taking that head on early in the conversation, the relationship between the different strains of the suffrage movement. And, you know, this really begins from the beginning. This really starts from the beginning with abolitionism. So
yeah, I'm happy to do that, but I actually don't think that's why suffrage didn't get the attention. Women's history got got a lot of attention starting in the 60s, but suffrage itself seemed a very old-fashioned goal. And so other aspects of women's rights, birth control, sexual freedom, they were much more interesting. And politics, it seemed so unsexy, shall we say. Having said that, let me go to your really important question, which is about the intertwining of race and gender. As you quite rightly say, the two have been intertwined from the beginning, albeit in a variety of different ways. The women's rights movement gets its beginning, gets its start in the 1850s as a kind of little sister to the abolitionist movement. All of the women in the first few decades of the suffrage movement are abolitionists. They're champions of Black equality. And the entry of Black suffrage into the political arena in the early years of Reconstruction is what brings the issue of women's suffrage, which had not been the foremost issue in the women's rights platform, which brings it to the forefront and also does something that wasn't the case before, which is it brings the question of the right to vote to a federal level. We probably don't have time to talk about this very much, but it's important to realize that the United States Constitution starts by leaving control over the right to vote in the hands of the state and local governments. And despite some efforts to change that, most recently, the Voting Rights Act, those have failed, and it's still in the hands of state and local authorities, which is why we're in the situation we're in now. The federal government has virtually no control over the franchise. Okay, having said that, the relationship between the champions of Black suffrage and the champions of women's suffrage comes to a head during the Reconstruction period in connection with the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment, which, as I indicated before, the Republican Party supported because they felt that they could count on the votes of Black men to take hold of the former Confederate states, did not include women in it. It says the right to vote, citizens shall not be disfranchised because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Suffragists believed, and they were right, that this would be the last time for a long time to a constitutional amendment for women's suffrage. Between the 15th Amendment in 1870 and the 16th Amendment sometime in like 1910, no constitutional amendments. The constitutional door was slammed shut. The suffrage movement, the women's suffrage movement and the Black suffrage movement split, and the women's suffrage movement itself splits over the question of whether Black suffrage should be given priority, as Frederick Douglass said, because of the violence being visited upon African-American communities in the aftermath of the Civil War, or whether whether the enfranchisement of Black men should be held off until women could be included as well. That's the split that occurs originally. But now we are moving into the later part of the 19th century. We're moving into a period in which new generations of suffragists who do not have connections to the campaign for Black freedom are in charge of the movement. And also we're into the period which we call the Jim Crow years, in which the right to vote for Black men is being rolled back. And none of the parties, certainly not the party of Lincoln, not the Supreme Court, nobody is interested in supporting equal rights for Black men and for Black people. And in fact, we are entering an era of terrible, lethal violence against Southern Blacks. And in that environment, the women's suffrage movement, many of its leaders, shall we say, accommodate to this new political reality.
Yeah, and what are the most, I guess, egregious examples of that accommodation? Because of course that some of those statements made by the great heroines of the suffrage movement put them into unflattering relief. Which are the ones that you think
well, there are three
we should remember and wrestle with?
We can talk about this, but I really want to make sure that our audience doesn't leave with the understanding that the most important thing to understand about the women's suffrage movement is that it was racist. There were white suffragists who helped to found the NAACP. Most of the time, the exclusion of Black women from the suffrage movement was a kind of de facto exclusion. It's important to realize that especially by the late 19th century, Black women had formed their own organizations. They were educated. They were committed to enfranchisement. They never stopped. If anything, they understood that the right to vote was, they understood that more than anyone else. The three most infamous episodes were the one I just talked about in 1869, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton, enraged at the exclusion of women from the 15th Amendment, over a period of about a year, talks about Sambo. She also talks about Hans and Patrick and Young Tung. A second episode is in 1913, when the great parade in Washington, D.C. that was organized by Alice Paul yields to the arguments of Southern white women, especially, Washington, D.C. was a Southern city, and the new government was a government run by white supremacist Democrats, of whom the president was one. And Alice Paul, the head of that group, agrees to basically segregate Black women in the parade. That leads to a famous episode where the great Ida B. Wells Barnett the most famous Black woman activist of the era, fights back against that exclusion and really sort of basically pushes her way into the parade, which would have been a very major event if the parade itself hadn't been overshadowed by the attacks of mobs of inaugural attenders in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, as I was thinking about your book, I shared your concerns about the possibility of kind of distorting the larger story and significance of suffrage by focusing on a central and important contradiction, you know, the racism of some of its currents at different moments. But it's true, we don't often apply that same kind of critique to the labor movement, a same kind of critique to different forms of discrimination that infused the civil rights movement. And I guess I wonder if you think that has to do with that sexism that you were talking about originally.
Yes, I'm not sure I can explain it better than I have. I do want to say here that although there are these episodes of racial rhetoric, racist rhetoric by leaders of the suffrage movement and by policy positions that are taken. For instance, right after the right to vote is won and Black women come to the National Women's Party and ask its support to press the federal government to pass an executive order, a law forcing the enfranchisement of Black men, which the 19th Amendment had authorized, and they wouldn't do that. Having said that, first of all, the 19th Amendment makes no limits on the right to vote. There are no limits. And to say
right,
Black women are not enfranchised by the 19th Amendment is just false. It's also true that Black women in the North voted and voted aggressively, and increasing numbers of Black women were in the North. So they become important figures in places like Chicago and New York. And finally, and most importantly, the obstacles to Black women voting then and now do not come from white women, however unpleasant, whatever racism groups manifest, but comes from the states. It's the states. It's the southern states that control the right to vote, and they are responsible for the obstacles to voting. We only have to follow what Stacey Abrams is pointing us to understand that.
Another obstacle in the memory of the suffrage movement, I think, has to do with what you were talking about earlier in the ways that maybe during the feminism of the 60s, it was imagined to be old-fashioned, churchy and teetotaling, but in many ways, the suffrage movement, which was very long, over 70 some odd years, was incredibly radical. And I was just wondering if you could kind of remind us of some of the ways it was radical, both in terms of its ideas and the challenges that they brought to the reigning ethos of the time, as well as the tactics, which really are still very much in play in many of the movements that we see around us.
Another excellent question, Robert. So let me see if I can remember the three answers I want to give to that. First of all, from the beginning until the end, I would say most suffragists link their efforts to get the right to vote for other aspects of women's freedom. For instance, actually from the very beginning with Elizabeth Stanton until the end, until the 19-teens in 1920, there's a link between the right of women to vote and what we would call reproductive freedom, reproductive rights. So these sort of private restraints on women's freedoms and public restraints on women's freedoms are linked. And again, given how central the abortion wars are to American politics, that shouldn't surprise us. Secondly, once we get into the early 20th century, the suffragists themselves understood that they had this burden of a kind of old-fashioned image. And so once we get into the early 20th century and in the 19 teens, we're really in a generation of younger suffragists they are modern women. Their hair is short in a bob, sort of like mine. Their skirts are above their ankles. They are educated. They have professional achievements. They're winning Pulitzer Prizes. They are very modern, very advanced women. And so to them, the denial of the right to vote is kind of ridiculous, harking back to a time when women had none of these freedoms. And there was, oh yes, you asked about tactics. There are kind of two kinds of tactics, particularly in the last half decade. The one that gets the most attention these days are kind of civil disobedience tactics, picketing the White House, being arrested, being force-fed.
Because of hunger strikes, which was
right.
Another kind of thing
right.
movement.
They have hunger strikes and they're force-fed, and they are women who consider themselves political prisoners, and they were. These tactics, which women conducted even as the United States entered the First World War, and to do so made them appear to be treasonous, which is why they were arrested, get a lot of attention. But there's a whole other set of tactics, which I found to be that I learned a lot about. And these are what you might call the less showy tactics, the inside game. And suffragists engaged in a brilliant lobbying campaign for 5, 6, 7 years to slowly break down the opposition in Congress, and to finally, in 1918 and 1919, get Congress to pass a bill authorizing the ratification procedure.
One of the things I was impressed about in your book is just the exhausting amount of human labor and coordination required year after year after year for kind of grinding victories and overcoming defeats at the state level. In retrospect, when we look at the victories of the civil rights movement or the women's suffrage movement, you can kind of imagine the winds of history propelling those movements forward on their own, but they were really propelled forward by, incredible sacrifice. And I was wondering if you might just tell us a little bit about how difficult some of these campaigns were, and also, what do you think enabled them to succeed? We're in another movement now, and so those questions are really important now. What enables a movement to break through?
Well, breaking through is a different question. What enabled them to break through was a changing political environment in the 1910s, which, just to pick up on a point you're raising, there was nothing inevitable about it. 1920 could have come and gone, and we would have not had the right to vote for women. The other question you're asking is I think one of the questions you're asking is, what keeps these women going? You told me you were going to ask this question. I'll be damned if I can answer it. It became their life's work, and they were so deeply dedicated to the freedom of their sex. I know that in Elizabeth Cady Stanton's case, she was a mother, and the fact that she had a daughter and a granddaughter who picked up this task, I think helped her to go along. But by the end, she was pretty discouraged. But, especially for Stanton, she kept on sort of breaking through to new levels of understanding of the subordination of women. At the end of her life, she develops a brilliant critique to answer the question that was most important to her, which is, where does the subordination of women come from? And to her, the answer was religion. And she has many brilliant things to say about that. Anthony never had children, but she did have proteges. And think they too helped her. She knew that she was going to be able to hand this over. And they both, especially Anthony, had the conviction that the arc of justice eventually, the arc of history eventually bends to justice. And I think she understood that. You know, all we have to do is look a little bit at the career of John Lewis, who had the same kind of conviction from the day that his head was broken open until he was there in a Republican-controlled Congress and watched the Voting Rights Act taken apart. But that was his conviction, his life's work. It's what gave his life meaning. And we can certainly take inspiration from these people for whom being defeated only meant waking up the next day and starting over again. I take a lot of encouragement from them in these dark days.
Yeah, it's also, it's inspiring and important to realize that, you know, a social movement can face short-term defeats and still continue and still eventually prevail and achieve its broader objectives.
These aren't even short-term defeats. They're defeated decade after decade.
Right, that's true.
They defeat one year and win the next year. And they're, you know, here we are 100 years later, and we can be falsely led into the idea that, well, of course it was going to happen. And somehow it was foreordained that it would happen in 1920 because we celebrate it in 2020. Nothing could be further from the truth. And certainly the people who were fighting for it had no idea when and how they would win.
As you kind of assess the significance of this victory as a whole, you know, what do you think the most important legacy of the suffrage movement is? I know there was a lot of discussion in the 1920s, critics kind of arguing that the grand hopes for democratic transformation were not realized. The Equal Rights Amendment, you know, ultimately didn't pass in the 20th century. And so therefore there was a way of depicting the suffrage movement as being not all that. But, you know, I wonder, now that you've really looked at it and tried to think of it in the context of the arc of history, you know, in what ways do you think the movement achieved its victories and transformations beyond the extension of the franchise?
Well, again, this is the question that we talked about before. It's hard for me to answer because the enfranchisement of half the population seemed, you know, I was thinking about this last night when I was watching the Republican convention, and it could be, here I am being political again, it could be a little discouraging to watch a party which is, whose leaders are hardly known for championing women's rights and for championing voting rights, proclaim the greatness of the 19th Amendment. But that's the point. Once women get the right to vote, it's important to everybody, to all sides, to both sides. I used to say this when women in Iran got the right to vote in, I think, 1964. And nobody ever challenged that. Even when the Ayatollahs were completely in control, women were sitting in parliament and they were on both sides. They were always on both sides. So the right to vote becomes, or let's look at the ERA or the abortion movement. The right to vote becomes a tool that women use on all sides of issues. So I think that we would, it would be more than naive to think that women gaining the right to vote, as suffragists themselves said, when men gained the right to vote, their rights did not automatically, when working men gained the right to vote, that wasn't the, they didn't secure everything they wanted. No, they had a tool with which they could fight.
Of course, when you, sticking with the present for a moment, I know from your preface or conclusion, I can't remember which, that when you began conceiving and writing of this book, you felt quite confident that that Hillary Clinton would be president during its publication, and that would be another way of kind of bookending the first wave of feminism. And I'm wondering, you know, how the Trump presidency has made you reconceive the movement, and what you think its significance will be in shaping new feminisms as they gain force. And then after this question, we're going to start moving on to some of our
Okay. So I want to thank you for great questions. If anything, the election of Trump in these last 3.5 years give greater meaning to the 19th Amendment. If Hillary Clinton had been elected, which would have been a wonderful thing, we would have seen suffrage as something that happened back then and then was finished, and now her election concluded that. And instead, what we see is that fighting for the right to vote and protecting the right to vote is something that every generation must do. And so, you know, to go back to your question of what I learned from these people, I learned, you know, if Susan B. Anthony wouldn't be discouraged, neither will I.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for everyone.
Thanks for your kind of passion and commitment and your work. And
yes,
please pick up a copy of this book. I think actually it's really useful for thinking about where we are now and the sorts of efforts and coordination that are necessary to make change.
And may I say, you can get audio version so you can listen to it while you're running, and also a Kindle version, but not that I'm doing my own book. Okay, thanks a lot, everyone.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I want to welcome to join us the Executive Director of the Hawaii State Commission on the Status of Women, Khara Jabola-Carolus. Welcome this morning. Hi.
Hey, Robert. Thanks for inviting the commission. And also
nice
for
to see
all
you.
So intersectional and making space for important gender justice issues.
Well, you are doing an amazing job of that in the State Commission. And you know, I think you've played an important role, as have others, in expanding what our conception of feminism might be and the issues that fall within its purview. But this August, in the 100th anniversary of the suffrage amendment, I wonder, just speaking nationally for a moment, like, what's your sense of where we are, how far we've come, how far we need to go toward achieving something like gender justice 100 years after the extension of the franchise?
Well, I think that it's undeniable that there have been significant changes that bring us closer to the status of women before the US colonized Hawaii, for example, and many other places. And I really like to use that framing rather than the framing of progress, because I think in many ways we need to look at what actually made up a more egalitarian society and look to Native women and Native organizing and Native feminism for that. So, you know, I mean, 100 years ago, nationally, women spent on average 15 years in some state of pregnancy and lactation. You know, you fast forward that to all sorts of ways that the law did not recognize women as their own individual, full human beings and attach them to their husbands. And then if you didn't have a husband, right, you were basically condemned to a life of struggle and invisibility. None of that has disappeared. A lot of those structures have, you know, been through bloody battles because feminists have led those at the legislative and policy level. And in terms of representation, we see a new wave of more women reflective of our community, so women of color at the federal level, which is another big metric of change for women. I think that we see more feminists than ever in my millennial and Gen Z generations, but perhaps more feminists than ever, but less feminism than ever. And I say that because I think that in many ways, what's being touted as feminism is not aligned with the political line of feminists. And we have more freedom to participate in capitalism, in the workplace, in the economy, but not the freedom to exit that. And that's something that I am really focused on and concerned with. But there's no way I can go over 100 years of changes. Sorry, that's the very broad strokes. So, you know, much gratitude to the women who fought to get us to this point.
And many more struggles to go. Focusing specifically on Hawaii, you know, in your sense, what are the remaining obstacles toward a more just gendered society that social movements of the future might be able to clear, and that you yourself have been working to clear? What remains to be done?
There are some really big obstacles in terms of what the pillars of male supremacy are. So there are many pillars. There's the cultural level. There's also the institutions that we have. The Commission on the Status of Women is a statewide government agency. I happen to come from the anti-imperialist left, and that is the work that I bring into it. You know, that structure that we have is being actively destroyed. It has been for, you know, it comes and goes in terms of who's in power. But I think that we really need an equity structure in place and protected, especially during COVID-19, when we are currently facing a 10 to 20% budget cut to our social safety net and the Commission on the Status of Women. I think that another barrier too that was touched on, you know, in your conversation was the role of white supremacy and the way that it's holding back more significant and radical changes in the women's movement. The Commission on the Status of Women is really where the rubber meets the road. We coordinate with frontline communities, disadvantaged communities of women, and we are the main policy consultant to all politicians at all levels in the state. And so we see in many ways, you know, this dominance of women who do have power, who were able to break through, affluent women, white women, and when women of color, Japanese, Chinese, immigrant women, Filipino women, Native Hawaiian women are challenging some of the priorities, a lot of the time we have to face off first with white women, unfortunately, although there are, you know, amazing white women who are allies and leaders with us. So that's another challenge, is really the ways that attitudes and, you know, interlocking oppressions hold us back. So those are some of the things I see on the ground.
Some of the members of the audience have asked about, you know, feminism and social movements in this moment in this pandemic moment. And I know you've been working on a kind of urging leaders to conceive of a feminist roadmap toward recovery, fighting the virus, and including precisely these sorts of constituencies you're talking about. But, you know, tell us for a moment about what you mean by a feminist response to the pandemic.
Well, like we've been saying, we chose the word feminist very intentionally because, you know, if it doesn't factor in women, then it is sexist, quite frankly. And so we wanted a comprehensive plan that takes into account that the economy that we have is dependent on exploiting women and, you know, holding back women from achieving full equality, being supported in their caregiving role and more. And so I hope people who are in the audience from Hawaii realize it might be hard to sense here, but how much international and national attention is focusing on Hawaii right now in terms of the women's movement. The Feminist Economic Recovery Plan was the first in the world, and it came from Hawaii. So we've had anyone from CNN to United Nations agencies asking us, you know, what it's about, how to model plans after it. And so I just want to give a shout out to all the women on the call who've been working towards that. And it's just a really important movement happening here.
A final question for you I had before we switch to kind of start talking about struggles over voting rights as the election approaches. You know, we were talking with Ellen about the vote, you know, being a central arena of struggle for the first wave of feminism. The Equal Rights Amendment became at least one of the objectives of second wave feminism. What do you know, in this Me Too moment of political division and cultural turbulence, what are your hopes for what the next generation of women at women's protest will achieve?
Yeah, I think the Me Too movement was a huge breaking point because oftentimes people think that women have no tipping point, and we do. And especially during COVID, we see more women being radicalized than ever because understanding how we're being viewed and disrespected and not supported systematically. So I see that I think that the next wave or manifestation of feminism will really be something that bridges the movement for Black lives and the movement for women's safety together, because those are often pitted against each other, and women are, pushed into a corner to align with the carceral state and prison as the solution, which it has not been. And so I really think that it's going to be a feminist justice reform centered movement that really is led by transnational, indigenous, and immigrant women, because, and Black women. And really that's who I'm seeing lead in Hawaii and who is really shaping the national conversation, especially groups like Affirm, have really started to shape the narrative and lay the groundwork for that. So that's what my guess is, Robert. And I may or may not be participating in it too.
Well, I know that you will be participating in it, and energetically and passionately, and I thank you for that. And thank you for joining us today and for all the important work you're doing on the State Commission.
Thanks too.
Okay, we want to turn now the conversation to kind of back to electoral democracy and its problems, its challenges, the restrictions, and the efforts to open the vote to more people so that a democracy can be more participatory and more voices are heard. Sandy Ma is with us. She's the executive director of Common Cause Hawaii, an organization that's been dedicated to enriching and expanding democracy for many years. Sandy, I wonder if, as the election approaches, if you could just give us an overview nationally of where you think we stand in terms of guaranteeing access to the vote, and making sure we have a healthy, open, functioning democracy.
Well, first of all, thank you for having Common Cause Hawaii on this panel. It's great to be among so many distinguished women talking about the suffragette movement, the 100th anniversary, and expanding the vote to more people in this democracy. I think we all understand that democracy is under assault. The right to vote in this country is under assault. Now, democracy is a system of government where the people, the power is vested in the people to exercise our right to vote. And there are so many ways in which that right to vote in our representative government is a tenuous, fragile thing. And we see how at every stage in this recent process, it's very fragile and it can easily be taken away from us. And so we constantly have to be vigilant. Right now, we're in the middle of a pandemic and we are being, we're having to choose between exercising our right to vote in person or having to vote by mail. And that is not a choice that we should have to make. For example, the United States Postal Service is under the new Postmaster General is having a slowdown in its services, and people are having to choose between going to vote in person or having to vote by mail. And so that is something that we are fighting against currently at the national level. So we are seeing constantly in the news about high-speed sorting machines being taken offline, blue mailboxes being taken away, especially in rural areas. And so that is something that is highly troubling for our fragile democracy. We shouldn't have to stand in line at polling location for hours where COVID could spread and our lives and the lives of our family and our community could be jeopardized. So that is something that is very troubling. So democracy is very fragile and we need to be tending and taking care of it. Something else that we should be very worried about is voter ID laws. And so certain parts of our nation, voter ID laws are very prevalent, being passed in a state legislature. Your first guest, Ellen Dubois, has talked about voter ID laws, and certain parts of the state voter ID laws are very, very common. Voter IDs law has a disproportionate impact on low-income populations, rural populations, people with disabilities, ethnic minorities. It takes a long time to travel to state governments, to areas to get the proper background information or in order to get the IDs to vote. For example, I am an immigrant. I don't have a birth certificate. Now, if a state ID requires that I produce a birth certificate to get the state ID to vote, I'm not quite sure how I could do that. I am a naturalized citizen. I have citizenship papers from when I was 8 years old that do not look like me now. So state IDs law disproportionately affect over 11% of our nation's population. So there are so many things that affect our right to vote.
Yeah, and because in some states, especially, elections can be quite close, these restrictions, especially if they disproportionately have an impact in certain demographics rather than others, like felony disenfranchisement, like voter ID laws, like document requirements, like, you know, the hours of polling places and so on, they can really have a determining effect on close elections.
Yes, you're so right. I'm so glad you brought up felony disenfranchisement. I'm so sorry. In Florida, for example, there was a ballot initiative that restored voting rights to people with felony records, except for people convicted of murder convictions or sexual assault convictions. And that actually restored voting rights to about 1.4 to 1.5 people in Florida. Florida actually accounted for over, 25% of the entire nation's population for felony records. And so that was a great achievement in Florida on the ballot initiative. But then the Florida legislature added an additional requirement for those people whose felony rights had been restored, felony voting rights had been restored, and required people to have to pay back all of their costs, court costs, fines, and fees and restitution before they could vote again. And so now that's being challenged in court because that's kind of like an additional poll tax in order to vote. And so that's being litigated throughout the courts.
Right. Yeah. One of the problems, of course, is that as Ellen was saying, traditionally voting rights were determined by the states. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 brought some federal order and regulation to that, but the Supreme Court has really allowed that act to fall by the wayside in terms of its significance. So we're back to fighting these state by state battles, including in Hawaii, though Hawaii, I should say, has achieved a lot of what other states, progressives in other states, have asked for in terms of extending voting rights. We've gone fully to voting by mail. Ballots are mailed automatically to registered voters. We even have a holiday, which at least in theory ought to enable greater numbers of people to vote. But I know your organization has also been critical of some of the ways, even in Hawaii, we have restrictions on voting or obstacles to voting that you think also affect some communities more than others.
You're absolutely correct. So we do have statewide vote by mail in Hawaii. 2020 is the first year that we are implementing statewide vote by mail in Hawaii. We have very few in-person polling options. We are concerned about that, and we have been very vocal in our concerns about that. In our August 8th primary election, very few people used the in-person voter service centers. So most people did return their ballots by mail. Only 1% showed up at the voter service centers. But even though very few people used the in-person voter service centers, we do believe that more in-person voter service centers should be offered. We do have houseless populations who have the right to vote. It is very hard for houseless people to received their ballots. Where are the ballots supposed to be mailed to? We are in the middle of a pandemic. People don't have, we have a very high unemployment rate. We are always worried about mass evictions coming up, people having to move. And when that happens, how is the mail supposed to follow them? Ballots are not forwardable. When that happens, people should have the option to vote in person. And of course, with the very few voter service centers that there are, that's going to be very difficult to do. There are people who don't have vehicles. So if you don't have a car and the ballot cannot follow you, then it's very hard to ask someone in a pandemic to get on a bus to travel to a voter service center. If there's only, for example, one on Hawaii Island, there's only two for the entire Hawaii County, and there's two only on Oahu for in-person services. Of course, Hawaii has same-day voter registration, so if you are not registered to vote for the ballot to be mailed to you in time, you should have the option to go register to vote and vote in person at a voter service center.
Thanks, Sandy, and thanks for your work. I think, you know, as Ellen was saying, when you have large numbers of people excluded from voting, you don't have a democracy that really functions. You don't have the voices in play that need to be heard, and therefore you don't find the policy solutions that can benefit greater numbers of people in society. So thank you for your work in trying to make sure that everyone has the right to vote unimpeded in Hawaii. And it sounds like we still have work to go. We still have a ways to go in that even here.
No, that's absolutely true. Democracy has to work for all of us, and it can't just work for a small segment of us.
I want to keep the conversation in Hawaii now with our next guest, Punihei Lipe, who is the director of UH Manoa's Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Center. And, you know, Hawaii has a parallel, quite distinct history of gender, power, inequity, and conflict and conception and change over this long history that we're talking about and of women's power. You know, in the 19th century, for example, as women were fighting state by state for the right to vote on the continent, women were already exercising in Hawaii a great deal of power, you know, before overthrow, including serving as head of state. And I wonder, how do you think the different conceptions of gender, of womanhood in Hawaiian culture kind of shaped the roles that women could play in society in this early period?
Yeah, thank you for that. Aloha kākou. You know, for Hawaii, when we talk about women's power, I like to use the term mana wahine, kind of an idea of an inherent power and energy that comes from us knowing that our grandmothers and our grandmothers' grandmothers live within us. And that's a really important piece of how I was raised, but I think also how women were raised in traditional Hawaiian society. You know, so when we know our grandmothers live within us, within our ancestral memory, within our DNA, it gives us a different way of thinking about our world. So in traditional Hawaiian society, when we grew up knowing that our female ancestors are amazing, right? And that they live in us, then we understand that we're amazing too. So for example, in the story of Haumea, or Mother Earth, right? She gives birth from all these different parts of her body. And so we understand that, you know, when she's giving birth from her mind, she's giving birth to amazing ideas. When she's giving birth from her mouth, she's giving birth to, you know, poetry and wisdom. When she's giving birth, you know, obviously from her womb, she is creating the race of people. And so when we know that Haumea lives within us, it gives us a different way of thinking about who we are and how amazing we can be. And I think what's also important in that conception is that men knew that too. Right? It wasn't some secret that we kind of knew on our own, you know, in some secret society. Everyone knew and had gratitude for all that women brought to the world. And I think, you know, that played a huge role in the respect that was, you know, given and received.
Perhaps because of that powerfully distinct way of conceptualizing gender instead of the kind of traditional patriarchy that Western patriarchy that women were having to struggle against and define themselves within. You women not only were playing central roles in that 19th and early 20th century history, but as the Native Hawaiian movement has gained force from the 1960s forward, and we're in a period of another re-energization of that movement now, women have also, I think, played extraordinarily prominent roles at every stage of that movement. Your mother has been one of them. And, can you tell us a little bit about the importance of women's leadership and feminism in the Hawaiian movement in the modern period that's shaping us now?
Yeah, and I think, this term manawahine is the one I'd like to use because it's the one I'm comfortable with. One of my mentors, Mehana Kala Hind, she reminded me once a while ago of the way we as Native Hawaiian female leaders, in all those periods that you're talking about, including today, we pushed beyond what we thought was possible because we know it had to be done. And if you've ever given birth, I've given birth twice, obviously you haven't, then you just gotta push, right? Even beyond what you thought was possible. And I think as Native Hawaiian women, when we were reawakened to that understanding of our grandmothers living within us, right? When we began to remember, through the Hawaiian Renaissance, like you spoke of, when we began to learn our language, our history, and our culture, and understood our ancestors and our grandmothers in those kinds of ways, that gave us, I think, a confidence to push beyond what we thought was possible because we knew, we had a little bit of backup. We knew that was, we knew that it lived within us already. And I think, in that time period, they did it with a fearlessness. And even today, I would like to say, we do it with a kind of, fearless love for our children and our aina, whether they're our, birth children or the children of our community, right? A fearless kind of love and knowing and connection to aina, right? That we learn through education again. And that all is a huge part plays a huge part in our ability, and especially in that Renaissance period and in the early 90s, for example. That's at least what I saw from my mom and my aunties that were on the front line. It was this commitment, and our featured speaker spoke about that today too. Waking up every morning with a determination to push beyond what we thought was possible. But I think part of that came from kind of the reawakening of our cultural connections in many ways.
Thank you very much. We have a lot of questions coming in from the audience. We're kind of approaching the end of the webinar, and I want to bring on our superintendent to talk too. But let me assure everyone who has questions, this isn't the only conversation we will have on the whole spectrum of issues that are coming forward today, and there will be, lots of other opportunities for us to carry forward these conversations. Punihei, thank you very much for your work and for joining us today.
Yeah. Thank you, Robert. I just want to say one thing as we transition, because it's related to education. I think the most important thing as we look forward is really to think about another wahine in Hawaiian tradition that doesn't get included very often in the English feminism movement, perhaps, but that's Mother Earth. And so for us, that is a wahine too. That is our most important wahine, and how we think about our connections to her for our future through education is going to be really paramount. So I'm so excited that Superintendent is here today. Mahalo.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us, Superintendent Christina Kishimoto. You've really made it a priority to try to foster civic engagement among Hawaii students. I know there are initiatives to try to address all of the issues, Hawaiian issues, environmental issues, and gender equity issues that we've been discussing and that Punihei was just referencing. Speaking specifically to gender inequality and the very long and multifaceted struggles to transform it and overcome it, what role do you think education can and should play in setting the stage for a society that's more equal for women and men?
Education plays a huge role, especially public education. If you think about the reach that the Hawaii Public Schools has, 180,000 students, it touches every year for 18, 19 years of these young people's lives. and then, getting them ready to be civically engaged in higher ed, engaged in the workforce. The big question for us is, what is that readiness and mindset that we're preparing them with? And so a lot of our work has been focused on voice, student voice, the empowerment of students and the readiness of students to engage in their community in the things that they're passionate about, to authentically bring their voice, to appreciate who they are, to love who they are, to love their place, to love this place, Hawaii, and to be grounded in it, and to be connected with people, to be connected with the Aina through that curriculum, and then to project their voice and learn how to develop it while they're in public ed. What's interesting is public education is not necessarily thought of that way. It is thought of as certainly a seat in a hub of democracy and of civil rights in terms of providing equity of access to quality education. But education is also should be the hub of innovation for community, a place where we prepare our young people to innovate and to become leaders in their community and in their society. And there's no more important time to think about the role of public education in preparing young people for what's happening around them, whether it's gender rights and equity rights, or whether it's these conversations we're having around these racial tensions, political tensions right now. How do we prepare our young people to be part of and lead in this conversation and be ready to be leaders in all areas of society moving forward? And that is, in fact, the role of public ed. The other side of that is us looking at how well are we supporting, uplifting public education for our students to be successful. Our public education system represents students from all socioeconomic, racial, gender perspectives, religious perspectives. And this is the seat, the place by which we can have really dynamic and incredible conversations about where we want community to go. How do we prepare our young people to really lead?
This is a much more ambitious way of conceiving of civics education than maybe we traditionally think of. Everyone knows, at least I hope so, and that's very presently visible right now, how important it is for for a democracy to function, for voters to be educated, to have the capacity to make decisions and weigh evidence and understand issues. So that's critical. But it's also this notion you're talking about preparing students not just to make decisions and be citizens and voters, but to be leaders and to speak out against injustice and to make transformation. That's a bigger lift. How, I know you have these kind of promise initiatives, and
yes.
How do you think you can accomplish that more concretely in the classroom so that students leave with a grander sense of purpose and possibility?
Well, we've been working as a community, and we've done community engagement all of last year around this promise plan. And there are some key components of the promise plan. One is student voice and empowerment. The other is innovation. The other is equity and really bringing to the forefront the equity issues. If we look at just right now with the COVID pandemic, certainly a pandemic, a crisis brings to the forefront the type of equity or inequities we have in our society, and certainly in public education. As we transition to in-person instruction, for example, to distance learning, we quickly learn who has access and who doesn't have access to connectivity, to devices, to being able to work safely in groups and on technology, who has those skill sets. And who's struggling, which families are having a difficult time supporting their kids right now as we have this distance learning, because they have job insecurities and food insecurities, because they have generational struggles that are a part of unsolved issues in our own state. And those inequities hit home really quickly when we're in crisis and within the public education system. And helping students to talk about what's happening in their own lives and talk about how do we solve these very difficult issues in society. It's something that's really important for us to embed in the learning process now, not to say they'll do this when they get to higher ed and work with you, Robert, or work with others, right?
Sure.
Or not wait until they go into the workforce. It's now that we need to help them to engage that voice. You know, what's interesting is I think it's this year for the first time in this nation, half of the state superintendents are women. That's a turning point. But we still have 20 states in this nation that have never had a female governor. If you look at Forbes' report, they celebrate this year as the most significant year of CEOs in Fortune 500 companies, and they're celebrating that there's 7.4% of Fortune 500 companies with female CEOs. 7.4% is a point of celebration. So there's a lot of work still to be done, and to embed this kind of information, real-time information, what the world looks like now in our curriculum. That's the kind of empowerment our students need. That's the kind of powerful curriculum. And we need a community that supports its public education system and also doesn't treat its public education as second class to other education systems. This is the true point of equity and access in this state.
Thank you. That's really a profoundly important place to close. You know, I think if there's anything that we can learn from the history of the women's suffrage movement, it's that, you know, in order to achieve that breakthrough victory took lifetimes of struggle. And in order to address the inequalities and injustices that are still before us, as you were addressing, and I think that's a very good corrective that you brought to us, how much still has to be done. That's going to require new social movements, and those social movements will have to be led by your students. So thank you for getting them ready for us to carry forward the fight. We're a little bit over time, so we need to bring this to a close, but thank you, Christina, very much for joining us today and for all your hard work in these very difficult circumstances. And that goes for all of the other panelists too. We are all making do and doing our best to rise to this occasion, and it's no small task, but it's inspiring to see the work that people are doing. So thank you.
Thank you, Robert.
Thanks also to everyone who joined us and who was listening today. I'm sorry we got to many of your questions, but we didn't get to as many of them as we would have liked. But we can carry on this conversation in other forums. So thanks to everyone. Thanks to Professor Dubois. And I also want to thank the sponsors of the speaker series at UH as a whole, which include the Hawaii Community Foundation and Kamehameha Schools as partners with the University of Hawai at Mānoa. And this event in particular was also sponsored by a bunch of other organizations, the Hawaii State Commission on the Status of Women, Hanahauali Professional Development Center, St. Andrew's School, the law school at UH, the College of Social Sciences, the Department of History at UH chipped in really generously, as did the Department of Women's Studies. The Hawaii ACLU was involved, UH Alumni Relations, the Scholar Strategy Network, Common Cause, YWCA Hawaii Oahu, which was one of the original organizations that fought for suffrage and temperance a century ago. You know, this series is a collective endeavor, just as the suffrage movement was a collective endeavor, just on a much smaller scale. We thank you for tuning in today. Thank you for thinking about these issues and discussing them with us. Thank you to our panelists, and be safe and keep up the fight. Aloha.